Greetings of peace. We are back with you in the Indigo Firmament, and we are continuing our discussion regarding the perception of Islam in the course of history. In the previous session, we reviewed and covered the Caliphal period, the Umayyad period, and the Abbasid period. And we just began explaining that third period, and now we are continuing in the sense of a multiplicity of imperial states. And by imperial I mean not necessarily as an empire, but as a super kingdom. In other words, I'm applying the term quantitatively to the size of the states that would have including large patches of territories across the three continents, from Asia to Europe to North Africa, which would define kind of the Darul Islam or the Muslim lands. We discussed in the earlier session that as the Abbasids empire was becoming fractured, this was not a disintegration of the empire. Rather, the mere size of the empire made it impossible to manage such a large expanse of territory between the borders of China and borders of southern France, for example. And so out of that necessity, that perhaps even in modern times, it's difficult to manage administratively under one state. So we had these various states developing. I also alluded to the fact that the main theme, the main thrust, the main characteristics, and the main trait of the Abbasids was the efflorescence of the civilizational Islam. The civilizational aspect has to be defined both in terms of science, in terms of technology, trade, business, social interaction. And I think in this, the custom and rite of Hajj or pilgrimage was instrumental, that this annual rite of religious practice, the pilgrimage, allowed for thousands of people who would come from India and China and meet with those who came from Spain and, say, Morocco and Egypt and Persia and parts of Byzantium and Anatolia and the extents of the Arabian Peninsula and the east coast of Africa. In other words, Baghdad became kind of the hub of activities. Yes, the actual rites and rituals take place in Mecca and Medina, but the proximity and the actual location of Baghdad as being in this crossroads of the three continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa, as the seat of the government, became a magnet for people who had ideas, for people who came up with inventions, for people who came up with things that may or may not have been popular in one part, but kind of it provided a central stage for that. Take the concept of the invention of paper in China. So in the pre-Islamic period, that was a Chinese phenomenon in a Chinese cultural setting and in a Chinese civilizational setting. Only the Chinese knew what paper was. Only the Egyptians knew what papyrus was. The rest of the world did not have access to these, and perhaps did not know anything about them, and so therefore they could write on woods and on earthen tablets that they baked, on leather, on parchment, on every other means except for the paper and the papyrus. And that's because these civilizations grew in the cultural bed of a particular geographic setting. And so therefore, paper may have been a great invention, but it remained exclusive to China. And since China did not interact, perhaps minimally, but not really interacted that much with the rest of the world, then this cross efflorescence of creations and inventions was not visible. What Islam as a civilizational force provided for all these was to provide a central stage. And as a result, once the Chinese brought their invention to this central stage, before you knew it, there were paper mills in Spain, which would be thousands of miles away, and perhaps in parts of Africa. And that would also go, say, for silk and textile and other inventions they had. So, in other words, this universality of religious Islam became the universality of the civilizational Islam. And since Islam was established as a state at the time during the life of its founder, the Prophet Muhammad, therefore its developmental stages had the benefit of the guidance of its founder, which is very different from, say, Christianity, where the establishment of Roman Catholicism happened centuries after Jesus, or that of Byzantium during Constantine happened at a time when Jesus no longer lived. And so we have no idea how much of that would have been approved by Jesus had he seen it the way it evolved. And therefore that, and the other factor that that Christians were persecuted for centuries after Jesus, and that during those tumultuous times that Christians were suffering, and then when they had the power, again, that transition did not happen peacefully. In other words, Christianity as a state system had troubled childhood, whereas Islam from the very start had a very healthy childhood as a state evolving into its own existence, because it happened during the life of the Prophet, and it was the Prophet who was responsible for establishing the state in Medina and setting certain norms and standards and procedures. Of course, not everything that one would desire, especially in terms of succession and all that, but in many other respects there was a model that was established. So if we go then to this healthy childhood development of the state in Medina, then replicated at a larger scale in Baghdad, that provided for this healthy attitude towards receptivity. And by that I mean Muslims had this very strong sense of confidence in knowing who they were. Therefore, when ideas were suggested by others, and I will define ideas in a minute, when ideas and concepts were suggested by others, Muslims did not shy away from them because they did not feel threatened by them. And this resulted in having an open door policy towards any idea, concept, notion, theory, philosophy, or thought that came from other lands. So yes, in terms of inventions and creations and all that, there was plenty of evidence of that. But there were also things in terms of science and philosophy. Take the concept of zero, for example, that came from India. And the Muslims had already developed their own numbers, the Arabic numbers from 1 to 9. Adding that to the zero of the Indians, you got a complete decimal system that is the basis of everything scientific in today's world. Imagine where we would have been without them. There's no way we could have reached the moon if we still had the Roman pictographs, for example, for numbers, because it would have been there could have been no calculations, not much of mathematics in the sense that we know them today, no algebra, fractions, no logarithm, and so on and so forth. And take logarithm, for example, that also came from Central Asia. Algebra, that came from Egypt. And just in this simple field, take geometry, that came from Persia. The art of mosaics, and so on. And so therefore, these inventions that came from all lands far and near, and found a stage, which at that time Baghdad would have been the world stage. That would have been the central stage. Baghdad would have been the equivalent of, say, London and New York in the 20th and 21st century. But it was in the Muslim lands, and therefore that exchange and interchange of ideas added to the prosperity of everyone. Windmills that came from Afghanistan, for example, and the many more inventions that have been documented, I think, in a project I think titled 1001 Inventions of the Muslim World, that was in display here in Los Angeles for 2 years. 2-3 years, about 2 or 3 years ago, was a prime example of that, which really, for those of you who may have visited it here, either in Los Angeles or in Germany, and I think there were a number of other displays through various other museums around the world, really shows how much of where we are today would not have been possible had the Muslims not created this global, universal, civilizational, inclusive format. So then in that sense we can see that whether a Muslim scientist could perform, say, cataract operations in Spain, or whether under Harun al-Rashid there were 1,000 hospitals in Baghdad that practiced things such as quarantine, for instance, which would have been something people didn't know before. And perhaps this very simple thing of the hygienes that is rooted in the practice of ablution and washing for prayer. Now imagine that if in the arid desert of Arabia people were required to wash daily for prayer, 3, 4, 5 times, and yet Europe suffered so much from the lack of hygienes that when you look at most of the diseases of the time, that they have European names, Latin names, such as malaria, for example, which simply means bad air. Malaria, bad air. So people were deprived of the basic necessities because they were not within the confines of their cultural norms. They didn't take it for granted, whereas Muslims had to pray 5 times a day, where they had to wash, where they have to pray on a clean prayer rug, and so on and so forth. So this is how these very essential values become part of the culture. And the reason I'm mentioning that is that, again, when you do a contrastive analysis of the many horrendous plagues, the plague of London, for example, that killed some 500,000 people, and the other diseases that kind of destroyed Europe for centuries. One can look at it in a way that the devastation of these diseases, they could have been avoided had they been, say, Muslims, practicing Muslims, cleaning and washing as the Muslims do. That a lot of these could have been avoided. But of course they weren't, because that wasn't in the cards. And the fact is that when the Muslims went to Spain, part of their culture shock was when they asked people that, where do we wash? Where do we wash to prepare for our prayers? People in Spain had no idea what these Muslims were talking about. It was such a strange thing to them. Take the concept of, since we started on hygiene, for example, what is the word perfume? Fume is smoke, and perfume is smoking, and we are not talking about tobacco here. The Europeans had to get rid of their body smell in those days. I'm talking about the Dark Ages. They had to get rid of their body smell by standing over a fire and smoke, so that the smoke would replace the body smell. Sorry to give you such a harsh example, but that's exactly what it was. So a woman who had perfumed herself has simply stood over smoke, the smoke of some fire, for one smell to replace another. And we could say the same could go for the men and for anyone. I didn't mean to use exclusively that for women. But the idea was that this was cleanliness in Europe. Yes, the Romans had aqueducts, primarily for agriculture. And if they had running waters in Rome, it was the privilege of the royalty. The few, the great majority, still suffered. Whereas for a Muslim culture, washing for prayer was the obligation of every person. I'm not saying that they must have done it perfectly or whatever. That's not our concern. The thing is that certain cultural norms contributed to the prosperity of the many and all. I observe, I'm sure many of you who live here in the West, I still see people who live in the 21st century they still go to public restrooms and leave without washing their hands. And I think a particular survey indicated that 25% of the women and 35% of the men do not wash their hands after using a public restroom. We are talking about the 21st century. We are talking about running water with all facilities, and everything is provided, and they do not have that sense. By contrast, Muslims were doing all this, including the brushing of their teeth, and of course the Prophet is the inventor of the toothbrush. Now, we don't have to idealize one and curse the other, but the point is that cultural values such as these contribute to the general prosperity of a society. And as I said, had some of these principles been implemented regardless of their religious connection and connotations and affiliations, perhaps a lot of the famines and the plagues and the common diseases that plagued Europe for centuries could have been avoided. So here the idea was only to look at the civilizational aspect, that Muslims were responsible for universalizing those because of the interaction and exchange, and because of the large empires that they had established. We are primarily talking here about Umayyads in Spain and Fatimids in North Africa and Abbasids in the Middle East proper, and then we had the Ghaznavids, and eventually we had the Mughals and the Samanids up north. In other words, these were large size. By contrast, Europeans had very small states, and these small states were very insecure, and because of those insecurities, they raised walls. In other words, they did not allow for a free flow of information. And their dark ages were dark partly because of that if there was any interaction, it was primarily because they engaged each other in these huge battles. And yes, we cannot rule out the existence of battles among the big Muslim empires, but generally, the reason that the Muslim lands were called Dar al-Islam is because they did not have this petty fights and battles among the kingdoms such as those that were in Europe. And for that reason, those areas, again, the dark ages of Europe, give them the title of Dar al-Harb, the land of battles and wars and strifes and struggles. It's hard to believe that to have been a reality when we look at it today, that the exact opposite is the truth. So there's peace and prosperity in the West now, and all those things that the Christian Europe did in their dark ages, we Muslims are doing it in our dark ages that are becoming darker by the day. But that analysis, we can go to that later, but the point that I'm making here is that yes, you can identify these, but a lot of us simply gloss over history, and we do not go to the analytical side of it to look how much life would have been affected by that, and the Muslims were responsible by affecting people's life in a positive way. Before the invention of paper, as I said earlier, in the Great Library in the Vatican, it's reported there were only 18 books, because not only was it very expensive to find material on which to write a book. But also, science was not the norm. Science was the exclusive right of the very few. In fact, the royalty saw it as a source of shame and embarrassment. They had to have a scribe to write for them and an announcer to read for them. So if you were a king or a prince in Europe, you were not supposed to be reading and writing, because those were considered professions. Professions were looked down upon. Professions were adopted by people who wanted to do something for a living, so they can make a living, so they can earn some money. And the royalties had to prove that they were so well off that they didn't have to read or write. Whereas on the Muslim side, it was the exact opposite, where Al-Hakim, the Umayyad Caliph in Cordoba, is believed to have had a library of 400,000 books. I'm sure there's plenty of exaggeration there. And there is even more exaggeration in the sense that it's claimed that he had read most of them. But having a library, having books, was a Muslim thing in the past. The exact opposite of what's happening now. When you look at modern times and all the inventions and the Nobel Prizes for all the creative thought, Muslims are probably, you can count them on the fingers of one hand, and the great majority are Europeans, or at least non-Muslims, where this would have been the exact opposite at the height of the Islamic civilization. And so perception is what we are talking about. The perception of Islam during the Abbasid would have been very positive, unless it was presented in a politically charged, or rather ideologically charged environment. When Europe saw itself as a Christendom, and by necessity called those other lands as Islamdom, the land of the Muslims, and in this adversarial competition, everything Islamic was looked down upon, at least from the point of view of Western European establishmentarian notion. That negativity persists to this day, which is the root cause of a lot of this East-West animosity to this day, that unfortunately has not been erased from the minds of many. But in general, this is how, aside from this factor that some Europeans would have been looking at the Muslim culture as something negative, for the rest of the world, it was the exact opposite. Muslims were inspirational, creative, self-confident, receptive, inclusive, and open to suggestions and ideas and inventions and creations. And it was due to that it was an appealing cultural identity, even to the Chinese. And there was a lot of exchange among the Chinese and the Muslims in Central Asia and Persia and what's modern Afghanistan. And these exchanges resulted in not only taking Chinese inventions and bringing them over to the West, but the reverse was also true, to a point where in China, for example, it was the Muslim influence that drew a lot of the Chinese royalty, including the great Chinese admiral who was responsible for the establishment of the biggest armada in the Chinese history that used to sail from China to the Indian Ocean. And it was these Chinese sailors who had a Muslim commander. And when I'm saying Muslim commander, I'm talking about Chinese Muslim commander. So you can imagine the positive perception Islam had. And when these sailors would go to their ports of call in the Philippines and in the other archipelagos in the Far East, in Indonesia, Malaysia, and those places, and they noticed that, and the locals noticed how disciplined they were, how clean they were, how at certain times of the day in these ports of call, someone would make a call to prayer, and these sailors would line up and worship and pray. They were so impressed by that the Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia, they all became Muslims because of the Chinese influence, not because of any, let's say, missionary campaigns by Arabs and others, but by the Chinese. And when you look at it today, the world's largest country in terms of population is Indonesia. And perhaps one of the world's largest countries, Muslim countries in population, would have been the Philippines, had it not been force converted by the Spanish. And that in itself is an interesting story, that the appeal of Islam was so positive that the people in the Philippines, in the various islands in the archipelago, they had all become Muslims. So when the quote-unquote age of discovery, of the age of the European discovery came about during the time of King Philip of Spain, and the Spanish sailors went around the world, when they arrived in what is called Philippines today, in these islands, they found out that most of these people were Muslim. And King Philip was so opposed, sensitive to anything Islamic, that he got so nervous, saying that, well, we got rid of those Muslims here in Spain, and yet they are, now we find them in these islands. So he commissioned a Portuguese admiral to force convert these Filipinos from Islam to Catholicism. And the plan was such that not a single Muslim should be left on these islands, because of that same Reconquista campaign the Spanish had started on the Iberian Peninsula. And the Portuguese admiral find this almost impossible task in terms of its implementation, that not only there were tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Muslims, if we use today's Indonesia as a model, which didn't go through that forced conversion process, then yes, there would have been tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands Muslim. In other words, that would have been the religion of the majority. But because he was an admiral, and admirals in those days did a lot of things for money and for fame and for being in the service of great kings. For those of you who, for the history buffs, we must also mention that, remember, the Pope had declared that there was an imaginary line 300 miles west of the Canary Islands near Spain, that everything to the east of that will be the domain of Portugal, and that to the west of that will be the domain of Spain. And so the Philippines, the Far East, fell within the domain of Portugal, and that's why the Portuguese admirals were all over the place, from Macau to Goa to Mauritius to almost every port city on the eastern coast of Africa, and during that entire region. So what the Portuguese admiral did was that he made a promise to King Philip of Spain, who, by the way, was instrumental in creating the technique of waterboarding that everybody's talking about these days. That was from the time of the Spanish Inquisition, that even in Spain people had to be forced into the Catholicism, to the brand of Catholicism that King Philip wanted. And so the Filipinos, the people of these islands, had to. Furthermore, they named these islands after King Philip, and so they became the Philippines. I'm sure they had another name before that. So the Portuguese admiral could do only one thing that was possible in terms of the promise he had made to the king, that he made a long list of names, Spanish names and Portuguese names, since these are Latin languages, they are pretty similar. And he started from the northern part of the Philippines, today's Philippines, and give everybody a family name, a Spanish family name. So if you go to the Philippines today and you ask somebody for their last name, if their last name starts with, say, A, B, or C, you can very easily locate their origin, that they had come from the north. Or if their names begin with, let's say, L, M, and O, and P, and Q, then they would be in the central part. And if their names begin with T, and W, V, and the rest, they will come from the southern. In other words, he made it obligatory that every citizen, subject in those islands had to adopt these Spanish names. Since the conversion of faith was identified with the change of a Christian name, therefore the admiral went back to King Philip and said, I converted them all, and here are their names. And it's, again, that name game that resulted in the forced conversion of Muslims in Spain too. In other words, there was a precedent for it. When Muslims were given a choice in Spain to convert, and in order to prove it, they had to choose a Christian name. And the majority of Muslim women chose Maria as their name because they revered Mary, the mother of Jesus. And the majority of Spanish Muslim men chose Jesus, as their name because they revered Jesus as much as they revered Muhammad. And so the reason that Spain is the only country in the world where people name their children as Jesus has to do with that concept of forced conversion and re-identifying a person by renaming them with a quote-unquote Christian name, Catholic name. There was a reason for Ferdinand and Isabella to be known as the Reyes Católicos, the Catholic kings. So that is what King Philip had inherited, and that's what happened in the Philippines. Yes, I took a detour of sorts, but the idea was that the perception of Islam was positive, and because of that positivity, people converted en masse, as in the Philippines, and as in Malaysia and Indonesia. However, the coercion of the Christian kings of Europe, just as they force converted Muslims in Spain, they also force converted Muslims in these islands that today we call the Philippines, named after King Philip of Spain. And so the coercion is one thing, the forced conversion is one thing, and the free will conversion is another. Again, to do a contrastive analysis, we come to the 21st century and we see how certain extremists in the name of Islam force convert Christians and other minorities in Syria and Iraq, because according to them, that's what God had ordered, which is another matter. We can discuss that in a different program. But the point is that, yes, we have made a 180-degree turn. Yes, we have exchanged places with the European Christians. The European Christians who lived in their dark ages and did terrible things to the human soul, that is the trait that many Muslims have adopted now in the 21st century by entering their own dark ages. The freedoms that Muslims provided, the freedom of consciousness, which probably is a contradiction because consciousness and thought can never be controlled or put in shackles. But the freedoms that the Muslims provided for their citizens and subjects back then is what's provided for people now in the West. So there's a complete role reversal. Now back to kind of summing up that aspect, that Islam would have been not only perceived as a very positive force, as a very let's say the in thing, if we can use this modern American expression, that if anyone was anyone, they had to be Muslim, because this was a very progressive, a very revolutionary, a very thriving and forward-looking and universally inclusive religion, ideology, belief system, cultural norms, civilizational force, and all that. So that would have been definitely very, very positive for the most part. Not only under the Abbasids, but let's go a little bit further into how the what I, out of necessity, I call the fractured structure. But I also explained that that would have been out of a necessity, that the sheer size of this huge empire was not tenable. It was not possible administratively. So the Abbasids for a time simultaneously remained in power. In other words, they did not disintegrate. They were not replaced for a long time, but lived simultaneously alongside other empires, of which we can again mention the Umayyads in Spain, and then of course in Spain we had other empires, the Murabitun and several others. But on the east also we had the Fatimids of Egypt, North Africa. We had the Ayyubids, Salahuddin Ayyubi in what's modern Syria and the Levant and the east coast of the Mediterranean, including Egypt. And we had various other states and empires. In other words, there would have been a kind of a mosaic of what we could say perhaps some serpentine lines of of domain in areas such as in the Maghreb and in Andalus and in Spain. And of course, then in the east we had the Ghaznavids in Afghanistan, and we talked about the Samanids. And then further down towards the Indian subcontinent came the Delhi Sultanate, which was established in northern India, subsequent to the Ghaznavi raids there. And then we also had the Sultanate of Rome, which would have been in Anatolia. Again, these would have been smaller political entities that slowly and gradually expanded and eventually led to the formation of one of the long-lasting Muslim empires, Sultanate or Caliphate of the Ottomans, which of course adopted different names in the course of its history. We also had the Mamluks in Egypt and in the Levant, and of course then we had the Mongols throughout Mesopotamia and Persia and Afghanistan and Central Asia. And so, as I said, a lot of these would have been kind of non-Islamic initially in terms of the religious affiliation of their leadership. However, in the course of time, that would have changed. So there is kind of a spotlight, if we use light as the Islamic belief system, that the certain areas would have been in the shade until the light was focused on them or shone upon them, especially when they moved closer to the center stage. Now, it's difficult to do a cross-analysis of these various dynasties that I named for you, and these would have lasted from the 1100s all the way to the 1500s, and I'm leaving that 1500 as a threshold, as a break point for that next period, which we will discuss perhaps in a later program. But what we can see here is that there was a very powerful positive competition among these huge empires. So, for instance, it's claimed that during the court of in the court of Mahmud of Ghazni, there were 400 poets and scholars. And let me explain the term poet, because in modern times the word poet does not carry the weight that it did once. For scholars in those times, the art and skill of poetry was a necessary requirement, as much as, by comparison, we would call the adoption of research methodology in modern times. So in modern times, when scholars write, they have to follow certain procedures in terms of research methodology, so that they would be adhering to norms of objectivity. So they would be analyzing based on a certain procedure of having hypotheses and theorizing and testing and retesting and replicating and all that, that only then would a particular theory be accepted as quote-unquote scientific. So these are our norms of the now and here. Now, the thing that haunted Muslim scholars in those days were the facts that things such as the copyright protection that we are so familiar with today did not exist. And because they did not have press, they had to write. And most of the scholarship was rewritten and copied over and over, and these copies were then distributed. However, it was often difficult to prevent plagiarism, and let me explain that. The plagiarism of today is negative in the sense that a particular person steals the idea of another without giving him or her due credit. In other words, one person claims the idea of another as his or her own. This is plagiarism. This is stealing. This is disrespecting the scholars who had the original ideas. The plagiarism I'm referring to in this place, in this period, is not necessarily negative, but you can't necessarily call it positive either. That is, that the scribes and the writers who were copying these manuscripts, if they got emotionally involved in a particular topic, then they would add a sentence here and a sentence there, and they would augment the arguments that they were themselves in favor of. And so therefore, the original manuscript that might have been, say, 10 pages, it would in the course of time become 12 and 13 and 14 and 20 pages, and it will be expanded upon because one person would like one particular segment, the other would like another chapter, and they kept adding on to it. So one way to prevent this, or at least to minimize this, was that scholars had to develop the art and skill of poetry. And the reason I'm using both terms is that the skill would be the art of prosody or aruz that have very strict established meters and forms and formats. And then the style part of it, or the artistic part, would be that the writer, the poet in this case, would put its signature line on that. And so most of these writers, thinkers, had their own signature line, and there, of course, their pen name would be attached to the last verse there. This was necessary because it made it difficult for people to add their own phrases and sentences to their thought. Once it's rhymed, it's difficult to add on to. But prose is a fair game to anyone. And so therefore, a lot of the scholars became poets by necessity of the fact that they could minimize this plagiarism, this augmentation of their work, so that the way they had rhymed something would make it difficult for others to imitate and to follow. And so to go back to the argument I was making, that during the in the reign of Mahmud of Ghazni, they say there were 400 poets. But if you take, for instance, Al-Biruni and consider him a poet, that will be an insult to him because he was a great scientist, not a poet. And the same would be true of many others. And yes, there were poets, there's no denial of that. But many of these were scientists and thinkers and geographers and historians and so on. Why am I mentioning this? It's because as much as there was negative, deadly competition among the rulers of Europe in the Dark Ages, there was that much positive competition in the courts of these rulers of the great empires in the East. And that's when the bragging rights for anyone who was anyone was to see how many scholars they had in their court. So this patronship of the sciences and of learning became the norm in the Muslim lands. Just as it had started in Baghdad, where they had Darul Hikmah, or the houses of wisdom, which give certain individuals the bragging right, as these Darul Hikmahs were responsible for the transfer of knowledge from other cultures, whether it came from Persia or from Byzantium, from the Greeks or from Indians, from Zoroastrians or Africans and others, that they were taking the scholarship that was heretofore exclusive to a particular cultural milieu, to a cultural setting, was brought and translated into Arabic and universalized in this sense. And so the people in Baghdad were, their bragging rights were to see who has the biggest Darul Hikmah, which also included Darul Tarjuma, or the houses of translation. So these were the houses of wisdoms, were very unique, that they were a combination of a translation service, and we're talking about scholastic translation, and then an analytical part where great philosophers would write their treatises on these original works of, say, Plato and Aristotle, and then they will bring it to the debate table when they were debated and analyzed and looked at from a point of view as to how much of that is applicable in their time. In other words, they not only resuscitated the knowledge that was threatened by Europe, they revived it and they revitalized it by analyzing them and by applying to them. Now, this model that initially started in Damascus and then moved to Baghdad, then became, it moved on from being the bragging right of the emperors to that of, from the bragging rights of the wealthy influentials to the bragging rights of the empires. So each empire was competing with the others who provided patronship to scholars and people of knowledge. And so to sum it up here, and again we have gone only to the 1500s, then Islam would have been a very, very positive force to change the human lot, the life of the average person in the known world at the time, which is, again, the Eastern Hemisphere. So the perception of Islam would have been very, very positive. Again, very different from what it is now, but that was the reality of then. And we will leave you with that thought until our next session, when we will move on to the period of this critical shift after the 1500s, as to how the perception of Islam changed in the Muslim world and outside of it. I bid you peace. Have a nice day until the next session of the Indigo Firmament.